In 1923, close to 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion. Someone, a photographer, someone else brought the family tree. Not one person in that room was a millionaire. That is not rounding error. That is not a bad year for one branch of a large family. That is the complete financial destruction of what had been, less than a century earlier, the single largest private fortune on planet Earth. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he was worth more than the entire United States Treasury held in its vaults at the time. His descendants built palaces that still stand today as museums, monuments, and wedding venues. And within 2 generations, the money that paid for all of it was simply gone. So here is the question sitting with: how do you lose the biggest fortune in the history of the country, faster than almost any family in the history of money has lost anything? Not through a crash, not a scandal, not through a single villain you can point to. The Vanderbilts did it in plain sight, with everyone watching, and most of them thought they were doing everything right. This is the story of how that happened. The rise. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a farmer who also ran a small ferry business. He had almost no formal education. By most accounts, he left school at 11. What he had instead was an appetite for control that bordered on obsession and a total indifference to being liked. He started with one boat. At 16, he borrowed money from his mother to buy a small periauger, a flat-bottomed sailing vessel, and began ferrying passengers and freight around New York Harbor. He undercut every competitor he could find, worked longer hours than anyone else on the water, and reinvested almost everything he made. Within a few years, he owned a small fleet. By his 30s, he had earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the Commodore. He built his first fortune in steamboats, and he built it the same way he'd built the ferry business, by declaring price wars on anyone who competed with him, often operating routes at a loss just long enough to bankrupt his rivals, then raising prices once the field was clear. It was a brutal, repeatable playbook, and it made him one of the richest men in shipping in America. Then, in his late 60s, an age at which most men of his era were long retired, Vanderbilt did something almost nobody expected. He sold off his steamship lines and moved into an entirely different business: railroads. He took control of the New York and Harlem Railroad, then the Hudson River Railroad, then the New York Central, stitching together a rail empire that connected New York City to Chicago. He consolidated competing lines, standardized track gauges, and built Grand Central Depot, the ancestor of today's Grand Central Terminal, as the physical monument to his new empire. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877, his fortune was somewhere around $100 million, measured against the size of the entire American economy at the time. The only honest way to compare fortunes across eras, that made him worth more than the U.S. federal government's own treasury reserves. It's a claim so large it sounds like a myth. It isn't. Historians estimate that Vanderbilt personally controlled a fortune equal to roughly 1 out of every $20 in circulation in the entire country. And here is the detail that matters most for everything that follows. Vanderbilt did not believe in splitting a fortune evenly. He thought most of his children were not equipped to run an empire, and he said so, bluntly, to their faces. Of his 13 children, he left the overwhelming majority of his $100 million fortune, something like 95% of it, to a single son William Henry Vanderbilt. The rest of his children got a fraction each. It was a decision that shocked and infuriated his family. It was also, whether he knew it or not, the single smartest thing he could have done for the fortune's survival. Because a concentrated fortune, in the hands of one disciplined heir, can keep growing. A fortune split 13 ways starts dying the moment the will is read. The monuments. William Henry Vanderbilt did something his father never managed. He doubled the money. In the 8 years between his father's death and his own in 1885, William took the roughly $100 million he inherited and grew it to something close to $200 million, largely by continuing to consolidate the family's railroad holdings. He was, by most accounts, a careful, methodical businessman, less flamboyant than his father, but every bit as focused on keeping the machine running. But William Henry Vanderbilt also did the thing his father had specifically refused to do. He split the fortune. Instead of concentrating it in a single heir, the way Cornelius had, William divided his enormous estate among his children, largely equally. It felt fair. It felt generous. It felt, to a 19th century family drowning in more money than any household had ever held, like simple decency. It was also the moment the fortune stopped being an empire and started being a pile of separate shrinking piles. And this is where the third generation of Vanderbilts did something extraordinary in scale, and extraordinary in what it revealed about where the family's priorities had gone. Houses, not homes, monuments. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, built a Fifth Avenue chateau modeled on French Renaissance castles, specifically designed to force New York's old money gatekeepers, the Astors among them, to finally acknowledge the Vanderbilts as social equals. It worked. You may remember from another story how Alva's 1883 costume ball forced Mrs. Astor herself to come calling. But a mansion built to win a social argument doesn't generate income. It only spends it. Then, Newport. The Vanderbilts didn't build summer homes in Newport, Rhode Island. They built cottages, which is the single most dishonest word in the history of American real estate. The breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, ran to 70 rooms and cost something in the range of $7 million to build in 1890s dollars, a number that, adjusted honestly for the size of the economy at the time, would represent hundreds of millions today. Marble House, built for Alva and William Kissam Vanderbilt, used more marble by some estimates than the Paris Opera House. Each cottage required dozens of live-in staff, ran for only a few weeks of actual use each year, and generated exactly zero income. They were pure, spectacular, gorgeous cost centers. Ask yourself what a house that costs a fortune to build, a fortune to staff, and produces no return on any of it actually is. It isn't an investment. It's seat. And the Vanderbilts were printing them by the dozen. By the 1890s, the family had roughly 10 major mansions along a single stretch of Fifth Avenue alone, on top of multiple Newport cottages, a North Carolina the size of a small country, built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, which remains the largest privately owned house in America this day, and yachts, private rail cars, and staffs numbering in the hundreds across all these properties combined. Every single one of those buildings still exists today. Most of them are now museums, or university buildings, or historical sites you can buy a ticket to walk through, which tells you everything about what happened to the Vanderbilt fortune. The monuments survived. The money that built them didn't. The mechanism. Here's the mechanism, and it is almost identical to the one that killed the Astor fortune, just running at triple speed. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a hunter. He looked at ferries and saw steamships. He looked at steamships and saw railroads. He never stopped expanding, never stopped reinvesting, never treating the fortune as something that had to be actively grown or it would start dying. His descendants inherited the machine and stopped being hunters. They became spenders. And a fortune that isn't being actively rebuilt isn't neutral. It's shrinking no matter how large the number looks on paper, because upkeep, taxes, and social competition all draw against it constantly, invisibly, every single year. Now add the same fatal flaw that doomed the Astors, but worse. There was no trust, no holding company, no family office. No single structure designed to hold the railroad empire together across generations, regardless of which individual heir turned out to be brilliant or foolish, or simply uninterested. Cornelius Vanderbilt's one act of discipline, concentrating the fortune in a single heir, was a personal decision, not an institution. It required him, specifically, to make that hard choice. Nobody built a system that would keep making that choice automatically after he was gone. So when William Henry Vanderbilt split the money among his children, and each of those children in turn split their portions among their own children, the fortune didn't just get divided. It got divided by heirs who had never run anything, spending on houses that never earned anything, with no institution anywhere in the family telling anyone no. Picture the family fortune as a single, enormous reservoir. Cornelius spent 60 years pouring water in faster than anyone was drawing it out. His son kept the inflow roughly matched to the outflow. And then, within a single generation, dozens of new pipes got drilled into the reservoir at once. One for every mansion, every yacht, every bull, every heir living on income rather than reinvesting it. And not one single pipe was ever pouring water back in. You do not need a design flaw or a crash to drain a reservoir like that. You just need time. And the Vanderbilts had less of it than almost anyone in American financial history. The fall. The speed of the collapse is the part that should genuinely stop you. The Astor fortune took roughly a century to fade from the very top of American wealth to a name on a hotel. The Vanderbilt fortune did something close to the same thing in half that time, or less. By the early 20th century, family members were already selling off the great Fifth Avenue mansions, the same houses built specifically to prove the Vanderbilts belonged at the top of American society. One by one, they came down, replaced by office buildings and apartment towers, the exact fate that had already swallowed the Astor mansions on the very same street. The Newport cottages became, within a generation or two, financial albatrosses that heirs could no longer afford to maintain. Several were sold off, donated to preservation societies, or opened to the public specifically because no descendant could justify the staggering annual cost of simply keeping the lights on in a 70-room summer house used 6 weeks a year. The Breakers is still, technically, partly owned by Vanderbilt descendants today, but only because it's operated as a museum by the Preservation Society of Newport County, not because the family runs it as a home. By the time you reach that 1973 reunion at Vanderbilt University, roughly 120 descendants of Cornelius built in one room, and a Fortune magazine researcher fact-checking the family's finances for a piece on the collapse, the math had already run its course. Not one of them was a millionaire. The largest private fortune in the history of the United States, built by one relentless, uneducated ferry operator from Staten Island, had been spent, split, taxed, and drained into non-existence in roughly 3 generations. Ask yourself how that's even possible. $100 million in 1877, a fortune equal to a meaningful slice of the entire national economy, vanishing completely within the lifetimes of people who were, in some cases, still alive to attend that reunion. It isn't possible through bad luck. It's only possible through structure, or rather, the total absence of one. The contrast. Now put the Vanderbilts next to a family that ran the exact opposite experiment, with a fortune built in the very same era. The Rockefellers made their money at almost the identical moment in American history. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a monopoly through the same decades Vanderbilt was building his railroad empire. But where the Vanderbilts split everything among individual heirs and built palaces, the Rockefeller family built institutions. They established the Rockefeller Foundation, multiple generational trusts, and eventually a family office specifically designed to manage the fortune as a single, professionally run enterprise rather than a pile of separate inheritances. Today, more than a century later, the Rockefeller family, spread across well over 150 descendants, is still collectively worth billions, still coordinated through the very structures their founder helped establish. The DuPonts offer a similar contrast. The family fortune, built on gunpowder and chemicals, was held together for 5 generations, largely because the founding company itself remained a family-controlled enterprise for far longer than almost any comparable American business, with ownership structured to keep the core asset rather than liquidated and divided at every death. The pattern is the same one you'll find in the Astors story, and it's worth saying plainly, because it is the entire lesson wrapped in one sentence. The families that keep their fortunes are not the ones who make the most money. They're the ones who build a structure that survives the people who made it. Cornelius Vanderbilt was arguably a more ruthless, more brilliant wealth builder than John D. Rockefeller. He may well have been richer, relative to his era, than Rockefeller ever was. And his family's fortune still evaporated faster and more completely, because brilliance in the founder means nothing if there's no institution forcing the same discipline onto everyone who comes after him. A fortune is not a number. A fortune is a set of decisions made over and over, generation after generation, by people who may not have the founder's discipline, his hunger, or his instincts. If you don't build something, a trust, a holding company, a family office, anything that makes those disciplined decisions automatically, you are betting the entire empire on every single heir, forever, individually, getting it right. And no family in history has ever won that bet indefinitely. The Vanderbilts didn't lose their fortune because they were foolish. Many of them were talented, educated, capable people. They lost it because talent was never the variable that mattered. Structure was, and they never, any. The callback. Picture that room again. Time 7-3. Vanderbilt University, a school that exists at all only because Cornelius Vanderbilt once wrote a single enormous check to fund it. 120 of his descendants, gathered under his name, standing in buildings built with his money, and not one of them rich enough by his own standard to be called wealthy at all. The Commodore built an empire out of a single rowboat and an unwillingness to ever stop expanding. It took his descendants less than 100 years to turn that empire back into exactly what he started with. Nothing. The Cliffle Hanger. But if you think the Vanderbilts collapsed fast, wait until you hear what happened to the family that many historians consider the single cautionary tale in American business history. A fortune built almost overnight on one single invention, spent even faster than it was made, and gone so completely that most Americans today have never even heard the name. That story is next.